The fourth chapter, rape sentencing and empirical analysis. I prescribed that.
Okay, great. So again, because this is a mixed group and some of them might not have read the others or not read the fourth chapter also and other chapters, I'm going to talk a bit about what's there in the fourth chapter as well. So for those of you who have read the chapter, I'm sorry for the repetition. But again, if any of you have, after having read, if you have any questions for me from what you've already read in those chapters, I'd be happy to answer that. So we don't need to just keep it to what I'm going to say right now. So I think we have around an hour and a half, and I think as I had discussed with Professor Nandita, it was roughly 1 hour for a talk and half an hour for a presentation, but I'm not going to do it like that, where I'm going to give you a monologue for 1 hour and have 30 minutes for questions. Rather than that, we will try and keep it participatory. Of course, you can put that in the chat, and we can also, if anybody has a point to make, we can, I think, get you on to make that point that you would like to, right? Okay, so broadly, I think what I'm going to talk about today is stereotyping in rape adjudication, specifically rape sentencing, and how sentencing is an important factor on which we have given very little attention to. And so therefore, I'm going to use rape sentencing as a context to try and also answer questions which I posed in my book as well, which was my doctoral dissertation, to look at if there's a problem in the sentencing process, how do you identify the problem? And once you have identified the problem, how do you find solutions to that problem? Is the solution just increasing the sentences, or is the solution removing the sentencing discretion that judges have? So we'll try and look at all of these factors as we proceed over the next hour and a half, right? So to begin with, let's, I think recently also we had the Supreme Court giving out a judgment authored by Justice Ravindra Bhatt, talking about stereotypes in rape adjudication, specifically in the context of bail. And if you remember, this was in the context of a high court saying that a person, releasing a person accused of rape on bail, say, being with one of the conditions being go to the house of the victim and tie a rakhi on her hand, and that was considered one of the conditions for releasing that person on bail. Right. Similarly, in the month of January, there were 3 or 4 judgments from the Nagpur bench of the Bombay High Court in the context of the POCSO Act, which created a lot of furor because of what the judge said in acquitting multiple accused under the POCSO Act, with the judge talking about certain situations not being rape, but at the same time using very stereotypical reasons for saying so, right? So if you look at what the Supreme Court says a few days back, it gives down guidelines as to what are the things that in bail courts should not be doing, and also talks about being sensitive to victims in this context, right? So the broader issue is we are not talking only about sensitivity towards victims. We are also talking about the entire criminal justice system and the criminal justice process, and that the rights of all the parties in the process are adequately protected. And that's where I would begin in the context of looking at what stereotypes actually mean, right? So as for instance, the Nagpur bench of the Bombay High Court, one of the things that the judge said in that case is that, look, there are no injuries on the body of the victim. So if there are no injuries on the body of the victim, that means that she has consented to the sexual activity, right? Now, of course, in the context of POCSO, that's not relevant at all because of the fact that under 18, even if there's consent, that's not considered to be valid consent. But this is an example of stereotype saying that if in a sexual act there was no consent, then there will be resistance on the part of the woman. And if there's resistance, then there will be injuries on the body of the victim, as also possibly on the bodies of the accused. So looking for these signs of injuries on the bodies of the victim or the accused, on the assumption that that you will that the woman will resist, and that resistance is going to cause these injuries. Now, in 2013, in amending the Section 375 of the Indian Penal Code, the Verma Committee suggested putting an explanation to Section 375, which is there now, saying that if there is lack of resistance and there are no injuries on the body of the victim, that does not mean that she consented. Now, why was there a need to put that explanation to Section 375? Because unlike English common law, for instance, or some of the states in the US, which require what is called this resistance requirement, India never had it, right? There were no the jurisprudence as it developed in India from 1860. The Penal Code of 1860 did not talk about a requirement of resistance. So, but courts were reading the stereotypical understanding of resistance into the Penal Code. Although the Supreme Court in multiple cases has said resistance is not required, one court or the other would bring up this thing and say resistance is required, which is why there was a need for the statute to clarify that resistance is not required. So that is one example of a stereotype. There are multiple other examples, right? One thing which you generally see is when we call rape accused monsters, beasts, animals, etc. Right? Here, the understanding is that someone who commits the offense of rape is like this so-called monster or beast, etc. And why animals, etc.? Because you believe that sort of animal behavior. Again, stereotypical, because animals probably don't behave in that manner, right? So when you say that, when you talk about offenders in terms of them being monsters, beasts, etc., you are doing what is called the concept of othering. Othering means people like us don't do it. It's these monster type individuals who are not really fitting into our society. Right? But if you look at the NCRB data, it is very clear, and if you look at reported cases of rape that we study in criminal law, you also see that it is not as if most cases are committed by strangers. Most of the cases of rape are committed by someone that the woman knows, right? So therefore, saying that this is the other is not helpful at all, even in terms of investigation and adjudication, because of the fact that the person who's committing the offense might be someone who is a friend, a relative, a neighbor, right? Someone who's closely in some parts related to the victim, right? So saying that the accused is of this nature is also again a stereotypical understanding of the nature of people who commit offenses of sexual violence, right? Then there's a stereotype that acquaintance rape, right? Which is again, like I said, most of the cases of rape is less traumatic than rape by a stranger, right? Again, a stereotypical understanding. Then there was again, so there, some of these are still continuing. So I shouldn't be saying there was and is something called the prompt reporting requirement, right? This meant, this said that, look, if a woman has been subjected to the offense of rape, she will immediately report it. So any delay in reporting shows that the case is false, right? Again, the Supreme Court, of course, in the mid-90s said in cases of rape, you can give 2 days is also fine. More than 2 days is also fine, as long as you're able to explain the delay in filing of the FIR, right? So again, the prompt reporting requirement, the Supreme Court has said not really required, but still continues in understanding of stereotypical understandings of what a woman would do on being subjected to a sexual assault. I already mentioned the stereotype of victims who physically resist. Another stereotype is victims are visibly emotional while testifying, right? So when a woman is testifying about the offense of rape, she will cry, she will break down in court. So there's a visibly emotional while testifying. Right? Then also the most prevalent one, that women make false allegations of rape. Again, some may, there may be people who make false allegations, but it does not mean all cases are false. But generally, the stereotype is, oh, all cases are false. We need to find the true ones amongst them, which is again not the case. In the Mahmood Farooqi case in the Delhi High Court a few years back, the court said something which is a very stereotypical understanding that's been around for centuries, that no does not necessarily mean no, right? No can also mean yes, something that the Delhi High Court said, and that a feeble no, as the court put it, may mean yes, right? Again, a stereotype. Again, in Farooqi, the High Court had said that there are different standards of consent depending upon societal and educational status. Again, a stereotype. Then that a woman will scream for help when she is attacked. So if she does not scream, that means no attack, it was a consensual act. And then some sort of typical post-assault behavior, right? So what will happen post-assault? Cases have expected women to tell their mothers, right? Saying the first thing that a woman will do in this circumstance is tell her mother. So if she's not told her mother, oh, that means it's not true. Or she'll tell her friends. There was a case decided by the Supreme Court in 2016 where the court found fault with the victim because she went back to the spot of occurrence, right? It would happen outside on a road. So she went back to the spot of occurrence to see if there was any evidence or whatever reason. She went back. So the court said that, look, it's not expected for a woman who has been raped to go back to the scene of occurrence. So because of that reason, they felt what the allegation that she made was not true. Another one is that you should not engage in communication with the offender if you have been subjected to rape by that offender, right? Again, in the context of acquaintance rape, that right might be very, very difficult, right? The offender might be someone who is a partner, who is a friend, neighbor, relative, etc. So to say that you should not have any communication with that person, or to say that if you had communication with that person, that means that the allegation is not true, is again a stereotype, right? So what essentially are these stereotypes? These stereotypes or rape myths are beliefs, right, about how people will behave, right? How people will behave during the incident, how people will behave after the incident, right? So all of these are beliefs, and these beliefs come from sometimes prejudices, right? You might say, okay, I think people will believe in this manner. And sometimes it's just from wild imagination, right? It may come, or sometimes it might be based on your experience as an individual, right? You may react this way to a particular situation, but that's not necessarily true that because you reacted in that way, the entire world should react in the way that you expect them to react, right? And so if you are in a position where you can dictate how people should behave, like the judiciary, if you say people should behave in a particular way based on your personal experiences, then what are you doing? You're taking your morality and your understanding of things and imposing it on the entire society, when in fact, for instance, the law does not require you to do that, right? So these are generally stereotypes that inform any sort of rape adjudication. So let me pose a question to all of you at this point, right? What is the harm that sexual violence causes? So as a lawyer, right, thinking as a lawyer, as a law student, how would you articulate the harm that sexual violence causes? Anyone? You can type it in the chat, or you can, I think, subject to Prasanandita unmuting you, and you can also participate. Put up your hand. So if you were to look at it from a perspective of the Constitution, for instance, what are the rights of the victim that are being violated? Right? Violation of personal liberty. Okay. Violation of the right to life, right to dignity. Okay, mental trauma to the victim. Autonomy. Right? Yeah. So all of you some of you have put it in to everyone, and some of the chats have come into me privately. So yeah, dignity, liberty, autonomy, all correct, right? So like if you've read the Verma committee report, you see yeah, violation of bodily integrity. You see that the articulation of sexual violence, the Verma committee said, should be viewed from a perspective of the Constitution, right, with respect to the fundamental rights. So the violation of bodily integrity, sexual autonomy are the important ones. Similarly, like some of you said, right to dignity is also a right that is violated by an act of sexual violence, right? So therefore, that's the correct way of understanding what is the harm that the offense of rape causes to the victim, right? But how have courts understood it, right? So you have a case of the Supreme Court. Right? I'm putting this citation here. Those of you who read chapter 3 of my book would have come across this. This is the case of Rafiq versus state of Uttar Pradesh, right? So in the case of Rafiq, the Supreme Court held, and I'm quoting, when a woman is ravished, what is inflicted is not merely physical injury, but a deep sense of some deathless shame. Right? So I'll repeat that. When a woman is ravished, what is inflicted upon her is not merely physical injury, but a deep sense of some deathless shame. Right? So what is the court saying here? The court is saying that, look, rape means that there is some element of uh, deathless shame on the part of the victim, right? The victim feels deathless shame upon her, right? And we will examine whether how you should look at something like this. Then you have another case. This is the case of Madan Gopal Kakkad versus Naval Dubey, right? 1992. CSCC page number 204. Now here, the victim was a very young girl, right? She was around 10 at the time when the offense was committed. This case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The accused has been convicted, and Madan Gopal Kakkad here is the father of the victim, he has gone to the Supreme Court on a particular issue about charging, right, and asking for particular other offense to be brought in. And in the context of sentencing the offender here, so the court has held him guilty, but in the context of sentencing him, the court says, and I quote, "We're told at the bar that the victim, who is now 19 years old, so she was 19 at the time when the Supreme Court decided the case. We are told at the bar that the victim is now 19 years old after having lost her virginity, still remains unmarried, undergoing the untold agony of the traumatic experience and the deathless shame suffered by her. Evidently, the victim is under the impression that there's no, and this is the word that the Supreme Court uses, there's no monsoon season in her life, and that her future chances of getting married and settling down in a respectable family are completely marred. Right? So the importance that the court is giving is not to all of the rights that some of you articulated: bodily integrity, physical and mental harm, sexual autonomy, etc. But is saying that the fact that she has not gotten married, remember she's only 19, the fact that she's not gotten married yet is an indication that of the harm that she has suffered. And so therefore, they say that's a factor that they will be considering in the sentencing of the sentencing of the offender, right? Now, should you be concerned about this? Probably, if it's relevant to the victim, that particular victim, yes. But you are considering as the Supreme Court that, okay, this 19-year-old girl, it's impossible for her to get someone who would be willing to marry her. Right now, is that what you're punishing the accused for? What if she got married in the interim? Would it change? I'll answer that question, right? Subsequently, of if she got married between when the incident took place and by the time the court decided the case, does it make a again, those of you doing the CRP second, you would have, if you're doing section 320, you would come across this recent case five years back of state of MP versus Madan Lal. Right. So I don't have the full citation. The 2015 decision of the Supreme Court. The question before the Supreme Court was whether a case of rape can be compounded under section 320 of the CRPC. Right? So the Supreme Court says this, and I'm quoting again: the body of a woman is her own temple. Reputation is the richest jewel one can conceive of in life. When the human frame is defiled, the purest treasure is lost. There cannot be or settlement, as it would be against the honor which matters the most, right? So this is what the court is saying in the context of whether a case under section 320 can be whether under section 320 a case of rape can be compounded or not, right? Was there any other way of doing it? Right? Those of you studying this CRPC, if the legal question before you is that can the offense of rape be compromised under section 320 of the CRPC? Is it compoundable under section 320 of the CRPC? What would your first principles answer based on the law be? Anyone? Okay, why is it not compoundable? Raju, why is it not compoundable? Not really offense against the state. So if you're looking at section 320, so if you look at the CRPC at section 320, the principles that Professor Nandita is talking about, anyone, what are the principles? Severity. So if you look at the CRPC in section 320, it has two tables, right? Section 320 says offenses punishable under the sections of the IPC specified in the first two columns of the first table can be compounded by the persons mentioned in the third column. So it has a set of offenses in that table, right? Then there's a second table which says all the offenses mentioned in the second table are compoundable, but with the permission of the court. That has a longer list of offenses, right? So you find the list of offenses that can be compounded in section 320 of the CRPC. So the CRPC very clearly tells you which offenses can be compounded, which offenses cannot be compounded, right? The Supreme Court in the past, using Article 142 of the Constitution, right? Article 142 of the Constitution is a power that the Supreme Court has to do complete justice. So using Article 142 of the Constitution, the Supreme Court has been going beyond the CRPC, right? The Supreme Court has been saying, even if the CRPC does not permit this, we are using Article 142 to permit it. And frankly, that's not what should be done, because you can't go, as even the court, beyond what the statute is saying, but the Supreme Court has done that in the past. But in this situation, in the offense of rape, it is not there in Table 1 or Table 2. So the simple legal answer to the question that I posed is that since rape is not an offense which can be compounded either by virtue of Section 320, since you don't find it in Section 320, that is the answer to that question. But the court talks about what a body of a woman being a temple, reputation being the richest jewel, right? And then, so therefore, because of this reason, we cannot permit compromise, right? So those are not legal reasons. Those are again stereotypical reasons where you're saying this is what we should think of the woman's body, and not in terms of, like some of you said, not in terms of bodily integrity, sexual autonomy, etc. Like I said, courts have in the past said Article 142 to do. We recognize that this is not a compoundable offense, but we think that the parties have compromised, and we think that to give it a quietus, let's permit them to compound this, but using Article 142, not using Section 320. In Madan Lal, the Supreme Court does not either talk about Section 320, nor does it talk about Article 142. It talks about this, the body of the woman being a temple, etc. Right? So again, this is again a way in which a stereotypical understanding of the offense of rape is articulated. Right? So therefore, again, I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to the question of stereotypes in rape adjudication. Of course, are there stereotypes around us in our daily lives? Any ideas? Anybody? Do you see stereotypical understanding of gender roles, for instance, in our surroundings? Yes. What are they? What are the most common stereotypical understandings that you will see around you? Okay. Again, I'm not saying about rape. Ujjwal is correct. When rape happens, some might question about the dress the victim was wearing. Yeah. So women are supposed to stay at home, cook and clean. So therefore, the gender role, this nurturing role, right, is for women, and that's not for men. Men are not supposed to do domestic chores, but that is meant for women, right? We had very recently the Supreme Court 3-4 days back in the context of the armed forces talking about permanent commission, right, for women. And Justice Chandrachud over the Babita Punya case decided last year, and this one a few days back, talks about all these stereotypes that are ingrained in society, saying, oh, women should not be in the army, right? That's not women's roles. And so therefore we will not permit them to be in the defense services, right? Or something very simple examples of stereotyping that you will come across, right? Which could be that, okay, men wear blue and women should wear pink. So if man wears pink, there's something feminine about that color, right? Where has that come from? It seems to have come from companies that wanted to market things in a particular way. So it made perfect sense for them to say that blue is a color for men and pink is for women, and then sell products which they make in that nature, right? Toys If you try to buy toys, you will see that a lot of toys, you'll have toys for girls and toys for boys that you'll find in a toy store. Again, in that context, you will find that, okay, cars and guns and sort of more macho type of uh, toys you will find supposedly meant for boys, and you will find Barbie dolls and whatever kitchen sets and etc. apparently meant for girls. And that's what the shopkeeper will also tell you. Go and ask, saying, I want a toy. The first question you'll get asked, is it for a boy or a girl? You answer that question, they will lead you to some of these toys, right? So there are stereotypes, general stereotypes also that we are surrounded by. And those stereotypes then, as you see, start entering your adjudicatory process as well. And I gave you examples of various stereotypes that inform and have continued to inform adjudication of rape cases. Okay. So now coming to the law, any questions at this stage? I'm going to move on to the law on this point. So if any questions at this stage, I can take them.
Not so.
Sorry?
I guess there are no questions at this stage.
I think there were some questions in the chat, and
Okay.
some of them privately to me, so you won't be.
Okay.
Principles of compounding, okay, I have a question on marital rape, saying, could you highlight the status of marital rape as an offense? How can a woman be expected to protect herself or take precautions without voluntary consent, right? Again, if you articulate rape as an offense, let me just see if there are any other questions there. Yeah. So, okay. So if you articulate rape as an offense against bodily autonomy, right, bodily integrity and sexual autonomy of the woman, you cannot justify having marital rape as an offense, right? So it's a very easy and clear answer. However, if you were to think of rape, like say, as an offense, if you were to consider the woman, the wife, as the property of the husband, right, then it's very easy to justify the marital rape exemption, saying, oh, but she does not have an individual entity outside outside her husband, so therefore, what rights? Okay, again, these are all these theories of which justify marital rape, be it that the husband has a right over the body of his wife, or there was a legal concept called unification, which means on marriage, the rights, both husband and wife become one unit. And so then all their rights are exercised as a single unit, and they don't have individual entities. Right? Now, when you say they don't have individual entities, it means the rights of the woman merges with the rights of the man. The man continues to have his individual identity and rights, but the woman does not, right? Again, outdated theories. None of them can be justified. So yeah, to answer that question, it is impossible to justify marital rape if we were to consider sexual autonomy and bodily integrity as the harm that the offense of rape causes, which is why the Verma Committee in 2013, in recommending amendments to the rape law, had said that if we conceptualize, and Verma Committee had conceptualized rape as an offense against bodily integrity and sexual autonomy, you have to remove the marital rape exemption, right? But the legislature did not do that. And if you look at the Parliamentary Standing Committee reports, some of the reasons why they don't agree to remove the marital rape exemption is also based on stereotypes. One saying this will be misused, second saying there are enough laws already to deal with it, third saying this does not happen in our country, right? So again, all myths and stereotypes have been used to justify the marital rape exemption. And frankly speaking, there's nothing that that should come in the way of the constitutional fundamental right of a woman to her body to be violated in this by having this exemption to Section 375 of the IPC. right after the Supreme Court's judgment in Justice K.S. Puttaswamy, where the court again reiterates not only bodily integrity and sexual autonomy, but also reproductive autonomy as a part of a woman's right to privacy. It is very difficult for the exemption to continue. So a challenge, which of course there are challenges pending both in the Supreme Court and the Delhi High Court to the marital rape exemption, it is very difficult for a court to uphold the exemption when like the 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court has clearly articulated that that a woman has the right to bodily autonomy and bodily integrity and sexual autonomy and reproductive autonomy, which is a part of her right to privacy under Article 21 of the Constitution. Right? Okay. So now moving on to the law itself on the question of rape, as you may have already studied, in terms of proving rape in a court of law, you generally rely on the testimony of the victim. You look at medical evidence, if any. You look at witness testimony, if any, and you look at other corroboratory evidence. Right? Now, the Supreme Court had to deal with the question of whether a woman, the sole testimony of a woman, can be relied on in convicting the offender. Right? So if the woman says that she did not consent to the sexual activity, can you, using that, convict the offender? Right? So this goes back all the way to 1952, where there was a case before the Supreme Court called Rameshwar versus State. Just again putting the citation here. It's AIR 1952, Supreme Court page number 54. Right? So in Rameshwar versus State, the question before the Supreme Court was whether a woman victim is an accomplice to the crime of rape. Right? Again, if you those of you who have done evidence law, you will understand the why this question was coming up. Again, how can a victim be an accomplice? Right? Accomplice, by the meaning of the term, means someone who is committing the offense with the co-accused. So why are you saying the victim is an accomplice to the crime? So the Supreme Court says, look, it's an insult to call the victim an accomplice to the crime. She's definitely not. But in the Evidence Act, the rules with respect to solely convicting solely based on the testimony of a person who had been articulated in the context of accomplices, right? So there was a rule that you can convict solely on the testimony of an accomplice as long as you are aware and are conscious of the fact that you're doing that, right? That you're convicting on the basis of the testimony of an accomplice who might have the interest to ensure that their role in the offense is minimized. To say, I had very little to do with it. Everything is my co-accused did, right? So that might be there. So therefore, you should keep that in mind. But it's not illegal to convict solely on the basis of the testimony of an accomplice, right? So in this case of Rameshwar, the Supreme Court said the same rule applies in cases of rape. You can convict solely on the testimony of a victim of rape, but you should keep in mind that you're convicting solely on the testimony, which means you have to figure out whether her testimony is reliable or not, right? And the court does not really give tests to figure out whether there's reliability. How do you figure out reliability or otherwise? Right? By 1996, you had the case of Gurmeet Singh versus State of Punjab. Again, a very important case in the context of rape law. The Supreme Court re-articulated that principle, saying that it is not illegal to convict based solely on the testimony of the victim, right? But there was also, until 2003, a section in the Evidence Act, right? Section 155, subsection 4 of the Evidence Act, which said that in the prosecution for rape, during cross-examination, the defense can ask the victim about her past sexual history to demonstrate that she was so-called of a immoral character, right? So therefore, through this element, what defense would try and show is that there was some past sexual history. Because of the past sexual history, now you can't believe what she's saying. So if she consented to intercourse with either this man or with someone else, it is likely that she consented to intercourse with somebody else as well. And so therefore she was of generally, quote, generally immoral character, right? That's what section 155(4) of the Evidence Act said. So past sexual history was a relevant question until it was repealed. Section 155 subsection 4 was of the Indian Evidence Act was repealed in 2003, making it very clear, right, that past sexual history is not relevant in rape prosecutions. Now, of course, this was a legislative step. In the 90s, again, Supreme Court in multiple cases had said that the past sexual history of women is not relevant in the context of questions of consent. So therefore, you should not be taking that into consideration, right? And then you have two infamous cases, the case of Tukaram versus state of Maharashtra, also known as the Mathura case, and there's a case of Pratap Mishra versus state of Orissa, both very infamous for things they said about the past sexual history of the victims involved in these cases, acquitting the accused based solely on the past sexual history of the victim. Right. So the law develops in this way. You don't really see any after Rameshwar, the next sort of cases which articulate progressive principles on rape law you see only in the 90s. So between the 1950s and the 1990s, you have this host of regressive judgments which are talking essentially about focusing on questions like past sexual history. Okay. I think we're around 45 minutes in, so we have another 45 minutes. So what I'm going to do is going to quickly talk about the case of Barbada Boginbai Hirjibai was state of Gujarat. Again, I'd requested Professor Nandita to circulate that to all of you. And those of you who have read chapter 3 or chapter 4 of my book, I discuss it quite extensively. Because Barbada Boginbai Hirjibai was state of Gujarat, decided in 1983, is, for those of you who haven't read it or want to read it in the future, I'm just giving the citation, 1983, 3 SEC page number 217, right? It's a very important case because of the fact that it tries and provides a checklist of circumstances that a court should keep in mind while evaluating the evidence of the victim of rape. Right? So remember, going from the case that we had of Rameshwar, the 1952 Supreme Court decision, the court is saying in all of this, the principle that's come through is that you can convict someone based on the testimony of the woman, but you have to find that the testimony is believable and reliable, right? That she's a reliable witness and the testimony is believable, right? So what the Supreme Court does in Barbada Boginbai Hirjibai versus state of Gujarat is that it gets into a complete stereotypical checklist making, where it says an Indian woman will not lie about the offense of rape, gives 12 factors as to why an Indian woman will not lie about rape. And all these 12 factors, basically, it can be boiled down to chastity, virginity, family honor, and marriage prospects, right? So if I were to break all 12 and just summarize them, it would be, like I said, chastity, virginity, marriage prospects, right? And family honor. So am I saying that if a woman experiences the offense of rape, she should not feel shame? Am I saying that family honor is not important? Right? Am I saying that marriage prospects are not important? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that everybody experiences a situation differently. Right? So what if you were to say in the law, right? If the Supreme Court says this, that it is important for us to see whether you felt shame. What you're saying is that everybody should feel shame, right? This is what we call prescriptive stereotyping. Prescriptive stereotyping means you're prescribing a particular behavior, right? Like one of you had said earlier that, oh, you're wearing clothes of this nature. right? Or which is why the offense happened against you, right? So if I were to impose that, saying to prevent this, I am saying all of you should wear clothes of this particular nature, right? Uh, then you're making someone ascribe to a particular way of doing things which you think is the way to go about. So therefore, if you say as the court that you have to experience shame, and I as a victim don't, for whatever reason, can you disbelieve me only for the reason that I am not feeling the shame which you think I should be? Or you believe that marriage prospects of a woman get impacted if she is a victim of rape, right? What if it does not, right? So are you saying if she were to get married, then it means there's some sort of mitigation? Uh, Again, in terms of family honor, some people might feel, yes, this is something that impacts the honor of the family. Others may not. So, but why are you saying, as the Supreme Court, that this is why an Indian woman will not lie about rape? Because of the fact that she will feel all of these things. And because she will feel all of these things, she is not going to falsely complain about rape. Right? The Supreme Court also gives 8 reasons as to why a so-called Western woman would complain falsely about rape. And then this has to do with the court talks about neurosis, about fantasies, about a woman being a gold digger, right? Very offensive category of things that the Supreme Court says that a so-called Western woman from outside the country, or it equates this Western woman with the urban elite, as it calls it, that because of these reasons, a Western woman will not falsely accuse or file a false case of rape, right? Now, how does this impact, say, a rape trial? So there's section 280 of the CRPC. Now, section 280 of the CRPC says that in every trial, when a witness is testifying, the court should make a notation of the demeanor of the witness, right? Now, demeanor, the CRPC believes is important in trying to figure out whether the person is deposing truly or deposing falsely. Now, again, remember that in a lot of cases, the judge who records the testimony might be transferred by the time the trial gets over. So there might actually be 1, 2, 3, or in some cases more 4 or 5 judges who go through that life cycle of that particular case. So this notation of demeanor is supposed to help both the judge who has recorded the evidence and their successors who might look at this and say, okay, was this witness reliable or not, right? So in this context, you will see cases where, for instance, the Supreme Court has said that, okay, now if you feel shame, you should cry in the witness box. Like I mentioned, remember the stereotype of being visibly emotional while testifying, right? So if you seem very confident in the witness box while testifying about the offense of rape, then you're not feeling shame. If you're not feeling shame, as per Barbada Boginbai, that might be false, right? So you do have cases which talk about it. Now, at the same time, it is not that someone can also make it up, right? You can, in the witness box, act very, it might be a false case, and you can act as if you're very upset, right? So would you believe someone who's putting up an act over someone who's actually been a victim, but for whatever reason is not showing that trauma? It could also be the way that person deals with the trauma. It could also be post-traumatic stress disorder because of which the person is not showing any emotions. So to say unless you show emotions, I won't believe you, it is a stereotypical understanding which then sort of gets ingrained through sections like section 280 of the CRPC, right? So why is that Barbada case that important? Now, on the question of consent in the Indian Penal Code, when you say that penetrative act has to be with without the consent of the woman, how do you determine consent? Consent in most situations will be because of the fact that there are only the man and the woman and there are no other witnesses in nearly all cases. You have to rely on their testimony. So you want to figure out whether you can believe what she's saying. So in all of these cases, because Bharwada tells you that it's providing you a checklist of whether you can believe the testimony of the woman or not, Bharwada becomes the case that is cited, right? So therefore, if you take any rape case where the question of consent comes up, either Bharwada is cited directly or you'll find citation to a case which has cited Bharwada. So the court in this case might not be citing to Bharwada, but is citing to a case which has cited Bharwada. Or sometimes courts just take the Bharwada principles without citing Bharwada or any other case at all. So therefore, in the process, this is one of the most cited cases when it comes to rape law, right? So again, you see a clear and direct impact of stereotypes on the adjudicatory process. Now, I also sent you an article yesterday, and again, it's also discussed in my book, where I discussed the impact of stereotyping on medical evidence, right? Again, I'm not going to talk about it now, but if you're interested, that's something you should read about, right? So medical evidence such as the two-finger test came into focus because you were trying to find past sexual history, and the indicator that these medical jurisprudence textbooks mentioned was that the two-finger test indicates virginity or otherwise. So courts started looking at whether the two-finger test was conducted, what the doctor said, and from there concluding on past sexual history, from that coming to the conclusion of whether the woman could be believed or not. So this is a more direct impact of stereotypical understanding of that pervades medical jurisprudence. Unfortunately, it's not something that we have gotten completely rid of. You can still see some of these things in medical reports. Although in 2015, the Government of India, Ministry of Health, put out guidelines as to medical examination in rape. As you know, thanks to COVID, that health is a subject in the state list, right? States have the power to decide on questions of health. The center has only to do with public health, right? Like now, you see vaccinations and public health is something that the center has power to legislate on, but the states have with respect to any other anything else on health. So therefore, this 2015 guidelines of the Ministry of Health of the central government remain guidelines, right? Until every state adopts those guidelines. So therefore, unfortunately, you still see some of these things in pro forma for medical examination of rape victims. At the same time, the textbooks, Modi's medical jurisprudence, which is the most famous of them, continues to be used. In the latest edition of Modi, 2016, Justice K. Kannan, who edited that volume, removed all of this reference to the two-finger test, said it should not be conducted, right? But most libraries, probably including yours, will have the older edition, right? So people don't buy new editions immediately. Also, these are expensive books, so around 3,000 rupees for a book. So therefore, again, a lot of court libraries have the older edition, so the reliance continues to be on the older edition. So it will take a little bit of effort to get this out of the adjudicatory process. I have a question on chat saying, notwithstanding how derogatory the two-finger test is, how would the two-finger test detect the rape of a married woman, right? The two-finger test cannot detect rape at all, right? It is useless. It's junk science, right? So therefore, to say that it would detect rape itself is a problem because, of course, as you know, rape is a legal definition, it's not a medical definition. Leaving that aside, does the two-finger test indicate evidence of sexual activity? No, it does not, right? And does it indicate recent sexual activity? Absolutely not, right? So it's absolutely a useless useless test. It was developed by Modi's Medical Jurisprudence of and Toxicology in 1920 in its second edition, which is what I deal with, that my co-author and I discuss in the Economic and Political Weekly article, which has been circulated to you. We trace the history of the book and show how this was completely junk science based on stereotypical understandings of women's bodies, right? Of trying to figure out how would a body of a woman who is engaged in sexual activity look like on medical examination, right? There's no scientific way of determining sexual activity by just looking at the body, right? But these attempted to do that, which is all junk science, which continued, unfortunately, for 80 to 100 years. I have another question saying, but didn't the Gujarat High Court declare the two-finger test as unconstitutional, violating the right to privacy? Yes, the Supreme Court in 2013, in the case of Dillu versus State of Gujarat, said, and again, said this, it said that it does violate the right to privacy. So the results of a two-finger test should not be used in adjudication, right? That's what the Supreme Court said. It did not say that test cannot be conducted, right? So doctors say that the court has not told us not to conduct the test. It says you can't use the results. And I don't blame doctors also, because what doctors say is, you know, I have a pro forma, right? This pro forma has been given to me by the government for medical examination of the victim. That says two-finger test. Now, until you change this pro forma, if I don't fill this, tomorrow when I go to court, the court will pull me up saying, why haven't you done your medical examination properly? The police officer will say, please fill the form completely. Why are these gaps in all of these things? So doctors say that, until you change that pro forma, I am bound to fill it. So I will do the test. You don't use the result. That's up to you as the court, right? But you have not told me not to do it, right? So therefore, that's the issue, right? I have another question on sentencing, but so I'm going to go into sentencing. So the next thing that I'll quickly discuss in the next 15 minutes is on the question of sentencing, right? So is there a problem with rape sentencing was the issue that I was trying to look at in my doctoral work, which is part of what is my book. And if you read judgments on rape, you would see that courts used all sorts of ridiculous reasons to reduce sentences. Right? Prior to 2013, the Indian Penal Code provided the courts the discretion to reduce sentences below the minimum of 7 years. Right? So it said, Section 376, subsection 1, said the minimum punishment for rape is imprisonment for 7 years, maximum is life. But courts can give below 7 years if they find adequate or special reasons for so doing. Right? So in a lot of cases, courts always gave below that 7 years. Right? They gave adequate, so-called adequate and special reasons. These reasons were neither adequate nor special. Right? So interestingly, when I looked at data, right, on this, what I found was that trial courts generally gave the minimum, right? So I looked at around in the range of 600 to 800 cases. So trial courts generally gave 80% of trial courts. In 80% of cases, trial courts gave the minimum punishment of 7 years. The problem was they did not give the reasons for them giving the minimum. Right? Why are you choosing 7 years? Why not less? Why not more? Right? So they didn't say why not less or why not more. They said, in the interest of justice, 7 years is sufficient. Right? High courts in a lot of cases, in nearly 50% cases, high courts gave the minimum, which meant in other 50% of cases, they gave below the minimum. And in there, when they were giving below minimum sentences, like I said, they articulated a series of reasons which were probably neither adequate nor special in the context that they were giving. So there was certainly a problem with rape sentencing. The problem being that it appeared to be irrelevant factors that were going into the sentencing process, right? So that's the problem, right? I don't have too much time, so I'm not delving more deeply into the problem, but this is the problem that you identify. Now, what is the solution to that problem? How do you ensure that judges do what the statute is asking them to do? Or is there a problem with the statute itself? Is it providing punishments which it should not be? And I'll give you an example for that before I move on. The age of consent in the IPC prior to 2013 was 16 years, as all of you may know. Now, in nearly all the cases that I studied, where the girl was just below 16 years and the boy was just above 18 years, right? Because again, the Juvenile Justice Act covered 16 to 18 age group boys, and they had engaged in consensual sexual activity, it would still be rape because the age of consent was 16, right? So in these cases, courts convicted but gave sentences below the minimum, right? They gave 3 years, 2 years, or you were in custody for 5 months, 5 months is enough, right? Across the board, trial courts to the Supreme Court. The problem in some of these cases were that the court used reasons like, oh, this is lust, and so therefore these young people have lust, so therefore that's the adequate and special reason for acquitting. No, that's not a good reason to do that. You could have articulated that, look, this is a consensual sexual relationship. Is there any reason for us sentencing the offender, etc.? Could that be something that those could be reasons that the court articulated? So it is a clear message that the courts were giving that at least in situations where they were close in age and it was consensual sexual relationships, maybe criminal law or these harsh sentences is not the answer to the problem, right? But what did the legislature do? And this is against the recommendation of the Verma Committee, increase the age of consent both under POCSO and under the IPC to 18, right? And now, again, you will see, and I know some of this work has been done even at the Center for Child Law that you have at NLU Orissa. It's very clear under POCSO, a lot of cases involve consensual sexual activity. And now we have increased increased the sentence to minimum of 10 years. And if the girl is under 16, minimum of 20 years, right? So why do POCSO cases end up in acquittals? A lot of POCSO cases, the moment you realize that the minimum sentence is one, of course, in context of consent, if it's consensual, the girl does not want to complain. She does not want to come and give evidence against her partner, right? Sometimes the parents might have filed, or in most cases, the parents might have filed a FIR because of the fact that they do not approve of the relationship, right? But she does not want to cooperate, nor does she, or even if after a point, when the parents realize that the punishment is 10 years or 20 years, they don't want to cooperate. So you and all your POCSO cases then start collapsing, right? So you have a high acquittal rate in POCSO cases, especially in consensual cases, because of this reason. So that's a clear indicator that something that the legislature has to look at, take a policy decision of what the age of consent should be. Should you treat people of the same age group differently, right? Those are some of the things that come up, right? So quickly, in terms of what I found when I looked at what are the factors that were determining sentencing practices by courts in rape cases, I looked at all cases between reported in the Criminal Law Journal, reporter between 1984 to 2009, right? This is the period in which my study was based. And I found that past sexual history was a very important factor that courts were taking into consideration. If the woman had past sexual history, then the offender got a lesser sentence compared to another offender who had raped a woman who did not have any past sexual experience, past sexual history, right? Marital status, like I mentioned, like I've spoken all through, seem to have a very, very important, seem to be very important in the context of sentencing. If the woman got married between when the offense took place and the time the offender was convicted and sentenced, the punishment for the offender reduced. So this is an understanding that rape affects the marriage prospect. So if she indeed got married, then the marriage prospects did not get impacted as much. So therefore, we should be reducing the sentence, right? Then there were also other factors like injuries, right? Like I mentioned earlier, if the injuries were present, the accused got higher sentence compared to other cases where injuries were not present on the body of the victim, right? In cases of acquaintance rape, the sentences were lower compared to cases of rape by strangers. A series of mitigating factors were considered by the courts in deciding whether they should reduce the sentence. Of course, mitigating factors. These included things like delay in the judicial process, socioeconomic status of the offender and the victim, marriageability of daughters of the accused, right? The accused having dependents, loss of employment, etc. Right? Of course, now, like I said, there's a problem. And how do you resolve this problem? There are various ways of resolving a problem with the exercise of discretion by a body which you have given the power to exercise discretion, like the judiciary, right? And this is not a problem that's unique to India or unique to judges, right? So if you give me the power to decide something and you want to hold me accountable, or you want me to exercise the discretion in a particular way, you will give me a set of rules to do that, right? And if I don't follow those rules, then that should become a a ground for you to say discretion was not properly applied in this situation, right? So for the judiciary, what are those rules? Those rules are in the constitution that you have to treat everyone equally. The rules are in the CRPC and IPC, right? So legislative rules which provide you what are the factors that you should consider. The IPC does not give us theories of punishment, but the IPC gives you this minimum and gives you those reasons. And with those reasons, you tie that up with Article 21 of the Constitution, right? Or like we said, Article 19 or 21 of the Constitution, and see whether the reasons that you're giving are in tune with the Constitution, right? Someone's asked me a question, which is what I was going to address, but isn't every case different, right? Yes, every case is different. Right? Everything is different in every decision we make, right? Even in life, right? So that does not mean there will be strands which are similar, right? So therefore, the important thing is we are not saying, and I am not saying that you have to arrive at the same conclusion. It's not that everybody should get 7 years, right? That is also arbitrary. If you give everybody the same punishment, then you're not considering other factors that have gone into commission of the offense. So what you're talking about is equality of approach. That the rules that you are applying in sentencing the offender should be uniform. That you can't be using different rules for depending on who you are. So Judge A is using one set of rules. Judge B, who sits in the adjacent courtroom, is using completely a different set of rules. So depending on whether you come before Judge A or Judge B will determine what sentence that you're getting, right? So Professor Andrew Ashworth, right, in his book Sentencing and Criminal Justice, talks about this, saying what we're talking about is equality of approach, not equality of outcomes, right? So that's something important, something to keep in mind, right? So therefore, can you use past sexual history? Absolutely not, because past sexual history, the statute says you can't use. So if you're using past sexual history to reduce sentences, then you're going beyond what the statute is doing, right? So therefore, if I were to go to an appellate court and say, look, this court, this judge used past sexual history, then that sentence given is illegal. So therefore, you have to redo that process again. So you're talking about equality of approach to sentencing. So like in criminal law, we say that your rules should be fixed, they should be knowable, and that they should be certain, right? So therefore, that is what is important. So each case might be different. Each fact situation might be different. Each individual is obviously different. But you have to use the same principles in sentencing every case that comes up before you. The problem that was happening was that courts were not using the same principles. One judge used the theory of deterrence, saying, okay, I need to give the harshest punishment here because I think in the offense of rape, deterrence is the theory to be used. And the judge, for example, Justice Krishna Iyer, when he was on the Supreme Court, believed that reformation was the theory to solve all problems, right? So he would use the theory of reformation. So if you ended up before Justice Krishna Iyer, in most cases, you would get a lesser sentence. But if you came up, for instance, before Justice Y.V. Chandrachud, who in some cases talked about deterrence being the theory of punishment, you would get a higher punishment, right? Similarly, currently also in the Supreme Court, some judges would say X and some judges would say some other theory. So therefore, that's not, you have to have a uniform theory that you're applying to all of these cases. Now, does the CRPC envisage something like that, right? Now, the CRPC very clearly says that there should be reasoning given when judges impose sentences, and that's in section 354 of the CRPC, right? So in the CRPC, you have what are called pre-sentence hearings, which are in section 235, subsection 2 of the CRPC with respect to sessions trials, right? So the CRPC very clearly envisages that both the prosecution and the defense have to articulate reasons as to why they believe the offender should get one sentence or the other. Unfortunately, what has happened in the Indian context practically is that this part of the trial, which was actually introduced in the 1973 CRPC, it was not there in the 1898 CRPC. It was introduced in the 1973 CRPC. And unfortunately, in most cases, what the prosecution and defense do in a pre-sentence hearing is to give standard format sort of arguments. Oh, you know, my client is poor, right? My client has dependents. My client is the sole bread earner for the family. So because of those reasons, please reduce the punishment. Now, judges hear the same reason day in and day out for every single offender, right? So they may not believe it, right? Or, so what is the defense lawyer not doing? The defense lawyer is not bringing before the court the factors that should be considered in the sentencing process. Similarly, the prosecution is also failing to do that, right? The prosecution, again, the prosecutor is an officer of the court, right? So the prosecution should also do some of these things, right? So therefore, that is the important issue that comes up. And something that we need to keep in mind is that, again, responding to the question of one of you, our case is not similar. Now, what we're talking about is when you say there's a problem in sentencing, where we use the term disparity in sentencing. So disparity means great difference, right? So in sentencing, you need to have disparity, right? Not great difference, you need to have a difference. Like again, your friend is saying here that you need to have a difference. Why? Like again, I said earlier, if you give everybody the same sentence, then again, that is also arbitrary. You need to look at the facts and circumstances of each case. So what is the problem? The problem is not disparity. There is something called warranted disparity, and this is warranted, right? When the facts and circumstances of each case warrant a disparity. But the problem arises with unwarranted disparity, right? Unwarranted disparity in sentencing theory is something where you're using reasons beyond the statute, beyond the constitution, beyond the legal framework. That is unwarranted disparity. So if unwarranted disparity were to seep into your sentencing process, that's a problem, right? So section 235(2) and pre-sentence hearing, like I mentioned, is an important part of the sentencing process. The cases after cases about this, about pre-sentence hearing, which if you pick up any textbook on CRPC and 235.2, you will see some of the latest ones. Being there's a case of Rajesh Kumar versus State in 2011. You have a case of more recent of X versus State of Maharashtra and X versus State of Bihar, which are more recent cases that came up from the Supreme Court in 2019. So X versus State of Maharashtra is 2019 7 SCC page number 1, right? So these cases, I'm just putting that citation down. This is right. Okay. Right. So you have all of this, but what did the legislature end up doing? The legislature in 2013 removed sentencing discretion completely. Right? Legislature said that, okay, what is the solution to the problem? We will remove sentencing discretion. So judges no longer have the discretion to give below the minimum sentence. So 10 years is the minimum for aggravated and non-aggravated rape. So judges don't have the discretion for giving less than 10 years. So what does that do? It leads to a situation where judges rather acquit than give the 10-year sentence if there's even a little bit of doubt in their mind about that, about whether the offense has happened or not. Now, if there's doubt about whether the offense has happened or not, you should acquit. But judges are sort of trying to now look at, instead of beyond reasonable doubt, are trying to find beyond all doubt. And when they are not being able to find beyond all doubt, then the thing is to acquit rather than give 10 years as a sentence. So I do say in my book that this was not the solution. The solution should have been more nuanced. You should have tried in articulating principles, like UK has done that, tried to articulate principles on the basis of which sentencing judges should operate. Either the executive or the legislature could have done it, or the judiciary could have done it itself. By not doing that, you have ended up in a situation where there is sentencing discretion is completely removed. Right. So I'll stop there. There are a couple of questions that have come in, so I'm going to answer that and then again open up to questions. So I have a question asking, if the rapist married his victim, would he be punished at all, given how marriage affects the degree of punishment? Right. So this entire thing of will you marry the victim, right? Will you marry the woman that you rape is coming from this, right? Thinking that, okay, marriage will solve all the problems, right? Does that really happen? Not, again, you hear, including in the Supreme Court recently, you hear judges saying this, but hardly any cases, at least reported, where you see that the accused actually getting asked by the court to marry the victim. But I'm sorry, I think the question is, if the rapist married his victim, would he be punished at all, right? Should he be punished is also a question. Say it's a consensual relationship, they've gotten married, should he be punished? That's the question. I would say no, because of the fact that if it was a consensual relationship and sometimes in a consensual relationship, if she was underage at that point of time, the parents did not approve of the relationship because it was inter-caste, inter-class, inter-religion, and that's why the case was filed. Should he be punished? I would probably in those circumstances say no. It should be up to the victim to decide whether she wants the case to be pursued or not. But if she has been forced into getting married, right, certainly then there should be punishment. But if the rapist married his victim, would he be punished? Would there be punishment at all? Yes, courts would convict. And in the past, they would give him the, say, below minimum sentence or the period of time that he has already undergone. Now, post 2013, courts may just acquit because of the fact that they don't want to give the harsh sentences that are prescribed, right? The other question that I have is whether reformative theory can play a role in sentencing accused in a crime like rape, right? Again, that's a policy decision that should be taken, whether reformative theory can work at all in this context or not, right? What would the reformative theory say? The reformative theory would say that, look, if you were this person committed the offense because of the circumstances that he was placed in. So therefore, instead of putting the pure reformative theory would say, instead of putting him into a custodial setting, you design a punishment for him so that he understands what he did was wrong and he does not repeat that again. Should that be used in a crime like rape? Possibly not, right? So obviously, the legislature is saying deterrence, right? If you look at all the amendments that have happened in 2018, 19, and 19 and 20, that is something that is something that is considered, right? So therefore, deterrence being that theory is what the legislature is saying. It's a policy question whether reformative theory should be used or not. Have there been any cases in relation to Section 376 capital C of the IPC? Again, for those of you who don't know, this 376C is those situations where it is sexual intercourse, but is not rape, right? There's a series of situations where sexual intercourse not amounting to rape, where there is a slightly different, where there's a power differential between the accused and the victim, and it's assumed that that power differential was the reason because of which the woman consented to the sexual activity. Hardly any cases, right? There's two cases. There's a case called Omkar Prasad Verma, decided by the Supreme Court in 2008. That was in the context of a headmaster in a school and a student, where there was some quid pro quo about not passing the student in the exam if he does not have sexual intercourse with him, etc. Again, that case was decided on its facts. So again, other than that, there are hardly any cases, right? So there's this question about rape with respect to men. Right now, is there a legal framework for dealing with rape on men, or transgenders, or anyone who doesn't identify as a woman, right? The Verma committee had recommended that the victim be made gender neutral, right? Recognizing this fact that there is sexual violence against men by other men, right? Violence against transgenders by men. So therefore, the Verma committee, recognizing that, had said that the offense should be made gender neutral with respect to the victim, right? The legislature did not accept it, right? And now again, a stereotypical understanding that rape is not possible, that the men cannot be victims of rape. And that's what the legislature sort of seems to articulate, right? So right now, any such cases will go into Section 377. Why do our courses never talk about the scope of redressable mechanism? I don't know if courses don't talk about scope of redressable. I do certainly discuss that in my courses, where we, like I said, you do have Section 377 currently, as well as, like I said, the Verma committee had spoken about it this in the context of making the offense of rape gender neutral for the offender, right? So if there are cases, the cases will be under 377, right? So there are not too many cases. And again, this also goes back to societal understandings of men not wanting to file such cases, right? You see under the POCSO Act, right? You see that there is the number of boys who are victims of rape is also as much as the number of girls. So POCSO is showing you those statistics. Why men don't complain? Again, that also probably has to do with societal stereotypical understandings of the offense itself and about this entire understanding of sense of macho-ness, or sense of seeing rape not as a crime of power, right, of someone exerting power on someone else, but viewing it as a crime just about the sexual act, right, not about the power that is there. So, of course, there is more need to talk about this and the legal frameworks for it, and I think that will happen as we go forward. Yeah. Any other questions?
I don't think so. I'll request everyone, if there are any questions, then you can use the next 5 minutes to ask them. Especially the fifth year students who have made the panelists any comments, any questions that you may have, you can unmute yourselves and take the questions. Sleepy evening, it seems, for them. Maybe it's the fifth year lag with the students. They don't participate even in the class of
No, it
perils of
also, I
war.
think it's a very dense topic, and I've gone through in 1.5 hours. So sometimes it takes time to digest also everything that's said. Yeah.
So I guess we'll stop here then if there are no more questions or comments.
Ma'am, I'm having one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Uh, Good afternoon, sir. So my question is, would it be appropriate on the part of the judges to ask a rape accused to marry his victim, who is a minor girl, or tie a rakhi to the person who has committed a rape on her? So, sir, what would be your opinion on this?
Right. I think the Supreme Court also very clearly few days back said that it's absolutely not appropriate, and those are based on stereotypical understandings of the offense of rape. And like Justice Ravindra Bhatt says in the judgment, it's obnoxious to be asking someone to tie a rakhi, or asking a minor to get married to the accused. So I think Supreme Court itself has clearly articulated that that's not something that should be done, and given on guidelines in the manner in which courts need to be more um, sensitive in dealing with any sort of violation, sexual violation, like the offense of rape is, right? So I think that Supreme Court has answered that question itself a few days ago.
So earlier there were prescriptions on what should be the conduct of the rape victim. Now there are prescriptions on what should be the conduct of a judge in a rape trial.
Right, those have been there. Yeah, those have been there, but I think the problem not only is with judges, it's with lawyers, or students, the society itself, right? Judges are also one of us. Unless we change, and of course, a lot of times judges will also tell you that these arguments are also made by lawyers. And we talk about training of judges, but we don't talk about training of lawyers on this. Or like say here, at least in your class, we're having a conversation about this. I'm not sure how many people have conversations on stereotypes or on rape law itself in their courses, right? So I think we need to start having these conversations to ensure that that what the Supreme Court is saying is actually implemented in its true spirit, rather than having another judgment saying something else and one more round of saying don't do it.
So before I go to the next question, which is there by Shreya, I just wanted to make a comment. When I was in a law school, the section on sexual offenses was not taught at all. It's like homework, you know this. So yes, that's a problem which is recognized. I have
Right,
few
and
more
similarly,
questions.
I will take that, but I think similarly when I've been teaching batches and batches of LLM students, both at especially at NLU Delhi and here at NLS, and that's the question. When you say sexual offenses, most people say we never didn't even open the sections in our criminal law courses, and I think that's where the problem begins with for lawyers, that you just ignore as academics, ignore those sections and say that, oh, I don't want to teach this because it's awkward, and that leads to people just not knowing anything about the law or how to deal with it.
Thank you. So there's one more question by Shreya. Shreya, you can unmute yourself.
Right, ma'am and sir, taking away from this conversation on sensitivity that is needed by the lawyers themselves. So,
Mm.
there was this recent case wherein there was a rape case in the Delhi High Court, and then the case was thrown out midway because the parties wanted to do an out-of-court settlement. And then the Delhi High Court didn't allow that. They said that, rape is something that shocks the conscience of humanity. So you can't do an out-of-court settlement. So since we are talking about this question of sensitivity in lawyers and judges, and I do think that was a very fair point that was raised by the Delhi High Court, in at least in my personal opinion. But from an academic or a legal perspective, what is your position on, or how do we deal with, should we encourage, discourage settlement in such matters? Because on one hand, we are still seeing, even if it's a minority of cases, there are situations when the victims end up marrying the accused, or some or the other way the case gets thrown out anyway. In this way, there is some kind of monetary situation. So if you could help me with that.
Right. See, at least I've done a bit of work in Delhi on looking at POCSO cases as well as rape cases that have been in Delhi courts. I was involved in training of the judiciary in the context of these vulnerable witness courtrooms that have been set up in Delhi. And a lot of cases that you see in Delhi are predominantly under POCSO, where the age of the girl, for instance, is 17 years, 11 months, few days, right? And the boy is some 18 years, few months, few days. Now, in these contexts, the case, like there's a very interesting study done in 2013 by Rukmini Srinivasan, who's a data journalist, data scientist, where she looked at all rape cases that had been filed in Delhi in 2013 for the Hindu Times of India, where she was at that point of time. And what she found, and she went and interviewed victims also in those cases, and what she found was that in most of these cases, the girls were not the people who had filed the cases. It was a male member of the family, a father or a elder or a younger sibling, who had filed it because they did not approve of the relationship between the partner and this girl. And of course, because of the fact that one is POCSO, under 18, they could file, or sometimes even if she were over 18, somebody in the family had gone and filed a FIR against the boy, against the man. So if you were to take these circumstances, I think very fair that these cases, it should be the choice of the woman to decide whether she wants to pursue this case or not, which is not filed by her, right? She was not the one who made the choice to file this case. In the context of children under 18, of course, the law very clearly says that there's also a mandatory reporting provision in POCSO. So you are required to file a case the moment you get to know that an offense under the POCSO Act has been committed. I think the lack of nuance that has happened in the way we have defined at least the age of consent, and the autonomy and the choice of the woman to decide whether she wants to file and pursue a case is what is leading to this sort of situation. The judge's hands are tied, right? The judge can't say, I will let you compromise, because the CRPC does not let you do it. If the judge were to let you say, okay, we can compromise it, especially a trial court, then that's going to lead to, one is it's legally wrong, and will also lead to furor saying, how did you let that happen? Right? So I think it is important to have those conversations where you're looking at a more nuanced understanding of the offense of rape in the context of the age of consent, which unfortunately we have not done. And also, I think it is very difficult, and I think the way the changing of the age of consent has happened around something like premarital sexual relations, or saying that this will sort of spoil society and things of that nature. So when you get into those sort of moralistic arguments, to have a nuanced legal debate around it becomes a problem. So therefore, I think that's something that we as legal academics, law students and lawyers need to look at, to say what is happening, right? Are we creating more problems by some of these sections like the age of consent, and how do we bring in nuance into it to ensure that choice is ultimately what is respected in the context of reporting of rape cases?
Sir, I guess it's time for us to stop now. It's been more than 1 hour and 45 minutes now. So thank you so much for your time this evening. And thank you so much for agreeing for this lecture and taking us to various nuances of not just stereotypes in the adjudicatory process, but various other ancillary issues like the age that you mentioned, which are pertinent, and with government now wanting to increase even the age of marriage, and in our country, marriage and sexuality being related to each other. We don't have sexual freedoms as such because there are no spaces available where they can engage in a sexual act, and other issues relating to it. The discussion today becomes really relevant. Thank you so much, sir. We look forward to hosting you in person soon at NLEO.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and it was a pleasure interacting with you and all the students here in the class. Thank you.